Welcome to the Mission Manhood podcast, where mature masculinity is celebrated and encouraged. My name is Angela Abide, and I will be your host. Every week or so, I sit down with a man who is in the men's movement, helping men grow and thrive in their masculinity, someone who is exhibiting characteristics of mature masculinity, or someone who has a perspective that might be beneficial for those who are seeking to grow and develop in that area. As a woman, I have a unique perspective as a mother and a therapist, and I hope to contribute to the conversation in those ways. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, I'm glad you're here. Today, my guest is C.B. Robertson. He's a writer, a philosopher, and most recently a podcast host. He just started his own podcast, and he's active on Instagram as Caffeine and Philosophy. In this day and age, it was such a treat to sit down with someone who is really knowledgeable and has a depth of understanding in so many different directions, but who also values the pursuit of truth above being right. And I really enjoyed talking with him. And I hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you so much for joining. Hi, Chris.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I feel like I always say this when I start off, but I met you through Instagram, and I've really enjoyed following your work, and just wondered if you could tell the audience who might not have encountered you a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Well, I suppose, first of all, I'm a husband and father, and maybe second, an electrician, and third, a sort of amateur philosopher. Amateur in the original sense of for the love of the thing. I don't have any 4-year, let alone 6-year or 8-year degree in the matter, but neither did many of the greats in the past, and it's a fun thing to explore in its own right. And so it's incredible the sorts of conversations you can get into and people you can meet just through that great social network.
Yeah, no,
on Instagram.
It's awesome.
I've managed to get in touch with some very fascinating people through there. You have to sort through the garbage a little bit, but people you would never even meet in college necessarily.
Somebody gave me early on this advice of we've entered this era where you don't have to be chosen. You don't necessarily have to have the degree or the training or whatever. You decide, I want to be a philosopher, so I'm going to start putting my stuff out there. And if you get an audience, then you're a philosopher. It's not the same rules anymore. I think that's pretty cool.
Right, exactly. Which is sort of what philosophy is about, is sorting through good thinking from bad. And it feels like many people in, I would say, the past 20 to 30 years fell into this sort of credentialism trap of outsourcing their discernment of the quality of someone's opinions by, institutional rubber stamping. Mm-hmm. And we've seen some issues with that in the last 2 to 5 years, longer if you've been tracking the sort of replication crisis in science and things of that nature. But the internet is really bringing a lot of it for all of its problems, and it has a lot. It's bringing some really interesting people together and ideas out there from unlikely sources. And it's a cool thing to see.
Yeah. And it actually gives me a lot of hope, because right now, without the ability to connect with people far and wide, I think I would feel so much more hopeless right now. But being able to identify some voices and find some people that are having interesting and engaging conversations really does give me a lot of hope. I appreciate you being out there.
Awesome. Well, yeah, it's a pleasure. It's one of the higher pleasures in life, in my opinion.
And I think you're being a little bit humble, because you actually are a published author and a podcaster. And we didn't mention those things yet.
My wife had been pushing me to podcast for the last year or so, and I finally got around to it 2 weeks ago. So we have first 2 episodes up, and third one coming up next week, which is the subject I've been researching for the past week or so, the Second Amendment in this case.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah, I read a post that you were doing, and it really sparked my interest as a history major and someone who really loved the Constitution, but having that deeper dive into what did they mean by this, or what context was this in. I think that's...
Oh, yeah. And it's extraordinary because I've always been something of a strong proponent for what you might consider absolute Second Amendment rights, and I still hold that position. But it's been interesting to see that there actually are some very strong historical cases for the other side here too. I don't think they ultimately hold up, but there is something there. It's just fun to see that this debate is not just since Heller, but it's been going on for the better part of 300 years, maybe longer if we go back to Britain.
I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about your work too, is like this intellectual integrity. You're willing to wrestle with it. You're willing to see both sides of the argument. And so many people, especially at the earlier levels of masculine development, are so concerned about being right that they sometimes won't even allow themselves to see the other side of the argument.
Right. Well, and aside from, in my opinion, that being the fun part, it gets kind of old just like winning in using, cheap emotional rhetoric. But I put up sort of a jokey poll on Instagram for my followers. Like, should I make a super strong case for gun regulation, or should I just destroy it utterly? And like most of the people, because my audience is really cool people, said, no, make the strong case, make the steel man case. Of course, it's a joke because you don't actually destroy anything utterly by straw manning it. That's not actually how you would take it down. That if you wanted to destroy something, you have to begin with the strongest case for it anyways. And you're unlikely to do it unless you can take, I almost want to say, an intrinsic pleasure in understanding and seeing what they're talking about there. And there's just so much to learn there. There's so much interconnected issues and concepts and ideas and historical events that tie together, and it's just a fun world to explore these arguments in it from a more neutral perspective.
Yeah, I'm a good bit older than you. Growing up, it wasn't so unheard of that intellectuals of different sides could be really good friends. And like Scalia and Ginsburg were rumored to be pretty good friends and family friends. Right. And they had really opposing views. And I think about people like C.S. Lewis and the guys that, he probably wrestled with. I mean, they had a respect and an honor for each other that is so absent today.
Oh, yeah. Well, C.S. Lewis is a funny example because he and J.R. Tolkien were part of a 4-man writing club. And for a while, J.R. Tolkien was the only Christian in the group. And eventually he brought C.S. Lewis onto that side, but one was Catholic and one was Protestant. And the other 2 members of that club were esoteric pagans.
Yeah.
We're very much not on the same side, but still good friends. I mean, my first intellectual hero, I would say, Christopher Hitchens, looking back on now, I don't think there's a single issue I agree with him on.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a single issue I agree with him on, except sort of free speech. But that doesn't stop me admiring and appreciating the spirit and the sort of energy he brought to whatever subject he happened to be writing with or debating on at the time. And you see that in Hitchens' friendship with Pastor Douglas Wilson, a very, very strong presuppositionalist Christian. Could not be further apart theologically, but deeply respecting each other for that.
Yeah. I'm kind of hopeful because I'm seeing a little bit about that sort of in the men's movement. People like Jack Donovan and Tanner Guzy creating a magazine together. Or I feel like I get that sense from your interaction with your followers as well. You are kind of identifying more on the pagan side, but you have Christians that follow you. And, there's a great banter, or it's not so right and wrong.
Well, we all care about what's right and wrong, but I think what everyone in that camp recognizes is that you have to put aside your own presuppositions if you want to actually get to what's right or wrong. You can't begin with the idea that you've already figured it out. There's this great Ralph Waldo Emerson quote where he says, "He who would pick the immortal fronds of goodness must not be, deterred by the name of evil in his exploration to see if something is evil." And the same would apply with good too. And I think many of the people who started as strong Christians became pagan, like myself, and vice versa. a friend of mine who I think has been on your podcast as well, Will Spencer,
Yeah.
Started very much off in the esoteric pagan world and has since become quite a strong Christian. I have a few other friends in that camp as well. And it's, everyone at the end of the day, I actually wrote a piece for Tanner and Jack's magazine Chest on Science about the nature of scientific, the origin of science as this exploration of the transcendent and the objective. And there's this idea of a theory as being a divine vision and a journey for that divine vision. This goes back to the Greeks going to the oracles to hear what the gods might have to say to them. And at the end of the day, the most important aspect of science and of all of these explorations is that pursuit. It's not really the set place that you happen to be at that moment, but the virtues that you develop in pursuing knowledge with openness and humility. I mean, it's not limited to science. Obviously, you can see it in political positions or in philosophy or in how to build a deck or how to fix a car, or, if you're more of a Robert Pirsig or Matthew Crawford fan, just basic tasks that people can sometimes lose sight of, but have the same underlying principles and virtues that will either make you successful in the long run or hold you back.
I love what you said about theory. And one of my pet peeves is putting that adjective conspiracy in front of a theory, because it makes people, it kind of muzzles people in a way. Like, I can't even allow myself to look at that because I don't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist.
It's funny because, I mean, who in the year 2022 believes that no one conspires?
Right.
I mean, like, it's fairly well established now. I don't think this is even very controversial. It's quite well known that the phrase conspiracy theory was essentially put out into public use by the government in order to discredit Vietnam critics at the time. George Orwell has this great essay called Politics of the English Language, where he describes the bad state of English that comes when people allow phrases to do their thinking for them.
Yes.
I think conspiracy theory is such a good example of that, because half the time what they're describing is not a theory per se, and it's also not a conspiracy. Many of the things that people are describing is like, we're seeing this done in the open.
Right, right.
It's not a conspiracy if it's not in secret. And also saying, I think this is what's most likely as just a hypothesis is not some kind of assertion of scientific truth. Very often it's just skepticism about the best intentions of our nominally elected leaders.
Yeah.
To say, I'm skeptical of their motives. How is that how is that a conspiracy theory?
Yeah.
That used to be common sense.
There's such a void of investigative journalism. I think a lot of people are just gathering information, talking to people, reading things, and then trying to put it together in a way that makes sense. And somehow that's a conspiracy theory.
Well, and it's a very strange sort of inversion of defaults that's been imposed on everyone, because I was under the impression that the scientifically minded community used to hold skepticism as this great virtue. And now skepticism is treated as a kind of character defect.
Exactly.
There's something wrong with you. You've got your tinfoil hat on if you express doubt in a prevailing narrative. When did that become the case? There's something incongruous about the expectation for what people are supposed to believe unquestioningly.
And it's interesting to me that it seems like people have gone to the extremes of belief, and they can only see that on the other side. They don't see that they're also doing it, depending on which side you're on. The religious right doesn't see that they're also demonizing those theories over here, and the radical left doesn't see that they're demonizing theories. And can we drop that adjective and come together and talk about it? Can we just let all the theories compete?
Yeah. And that's not to say that, all theories are equally valid or anything, but it does illustrate the value of philosophy and being able to emotionally take a step back for a stage, because no one likes being taken advantage of. No one likes being made a fool of. their own positions, and they think that admitting fault or admitting you might have been misled in something is a sign of weakness, and that you will be, to borrow a Hitchensism, safe in the moral majority. All that permits is, people being taken advantage of en masse.
Yeah.
We have seen that once or twice historically, and you're not safer in the majority, especially if you believe, as many people do, that the vast majority of people around the world are idiots, which I don't think is true. I think mathematically, the vast majority of people are average. But it's a very strange thing to believe that you're in good company if you hold the majority of opinion, while at the same time believing that most people are gullible and not very intelligent.
Yeah, that is interesting.
It's a tool set people have to learn to acquire. Unfortunately, we're not all born with that. We come with these social biases and in group thinking, and it can be a challenge in a tribe of 330 million people.
Yeah. And I think ignorance is not necessarily like stupidity. It's just I don't know, haven't been exposed to it. It's
Right.
been withheld from me. And I think people are just really tired, and they're tired because they're overworked and underpaid maybe, or whatever the problems might be. And then they just want to check out and they're distracted. And so they don't really dig into these deeper issues. So they continue to be ignorant, and it's easier to be manipulated like that.
Perhaps so, yeah. But the great thing, and one of the pleasures of reading people like Plato, aside from being much more interesting than and fun to read than many other philosophers, is that he really illustrates how owning your own ignorance can be such a tremendous tool. It can be such a valuable defense against the manipulations that we're seeing, which are very often plays upon our own grandiose senses of entitlement, intelligence, and knowledge, and so forth. It's very fascinating to hear so many people compare the United States in its current state to Rome at the peak of its republic prior to the empire. When you look back at the Roman statesmen of those times, the Ciceros, the Senecas, many of the Stoics, and so forth, many of the value that they all seemed to emphasize the most was the resistance to flattery. Flattery seemed to be this tremendously powerful tool of manipulating, senators and politicians and so forth. Cato the Younger in particular, but Cicero and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius very eloquently, all talked about the importance of resisting flattery. And I think if we are in a parallel state to Rome, maybe that's a skill we could all learn to develop as well.
Wow, that's such a challenge with the gluttonous desire for clicks and likes. That's what we're living for, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's tough because clicks and likes, if you run some kind of any kind of business that uses social media as your market, clicks and likes are kind of sustenance. Mm-hmm. It isn't just ego, it's literally your income. So it can be hard to separate sometimes. Yeah.
It's kind of like food. You're going to die without it, but you have to learn to regulate it in a way that can be healthy.
Indeed.
Hey, I wanted to turn back a little bit and ask you if you could tell me a little bit about why. What is your why? Like maybe how you got started, your development from like a kid to a lot of guys your age have a hard time admitting their ignorance. They have a hard time being at that point where they can wrestle with the truth. They just want to be right. So I thought that might be interesting for people to hear. How did you get here?
Sure. I suppose some background. In high school, I decided if I was going to have political opinions, because I was just sort of coming into that world from just, sports and martial arts and academics, it wouldn't make very much sense without some background knowledge of the military, which is sort of what distinguishes the state from regular citizens. So I decided to join the military just so I felt like I would have a meaningful opinion on political matters. Coming out of that, I don't feel like I learned anything other than that the military is a bureaucracy and doesn't do anything particularly well. But not being in college, and I did end up going to college for a couple years, managed to eventually get my AA after my wife pushed me. He's like, you have all the credits, you may as well apply. Fine.
Yeah.
But it was remarkable to see how many people in the military and in the university setting rest upon their own credentials, their own rubber stamping, if you will, as some kind of basis for the legitimacy of their opinion. And I'm not a dumb person exactly, but when you read people like Nietzsche or Augustine, or even contemporaries like someone like Vox Day or Jordan Peterson on the other side of that. Mm-hmm. Robert Barron is another example. There are some people who are, my current favorite guy to read is Eugene Volokh, one of those rare above 200 IQ individuals. You're just in awe of just how impressive some of these people out there are. And you're like, mm-hmm. I am nothing compared to that. These people are so well read, and they're so knowledgeable, and not just knowledgeable, but insightful on top of their knowledge on the subject matter. And to see other people mistake their credibility for being, in some sense, qualified to just randomly opine about these things.
Yeah.
Which I'm not against people opining. I think they should, but to understand the difference between exploring a subject and growing by trying things out versus saying, oh, Eugene Volokh is just totally wrong about this.
Yeah.
It really illustrated for me the insufficiency of these institutional processes for generating true intellects. And my goal this whole time has been to, I guess for lack of a better phrase, live a good life. Mm-hmm. And that's what philosophy is about. And it's the question that I believe undermines all politics. What does the good life look like? And how do we achieve that through state measures or not through state measures? And how to not mislive, if that's a grammatical phrase.
Yeah.
Seeing the insufficiency there, I decided to hang out on my own for a little bit, doing over-the-road truck driving. And then after getting married, that's not really a sustainable thing. So I was inspired to pursue manual competence as a virtue by a combination of Mike Rowe and Robert Pirsig, the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance guy. Mm-hmm. Supremely underrated book, in my opinion. And also Matthew Crawford, another extremely underrated contemporary philosopher who talks about the value of manual competence, and in his most recent book of Self-Motion. It's if Jack Donovan's The Way of Men is book one that every man should read, I think Shop Class's Soulcraft might be book two.
There's something so rich about having competence.
Yeah.
I'm looking at your Instagram. There's so many things that I jotted down, like practical strength, picking up rocks, just having knowledge of things, having skills with guns, being handy, installing a light. You're very well groomed at all times, and you're an active father looking for books. And there's so much satisfaction that goes into those type of things. And I feel like there's so much argument in the world of men about what's gone wrong with masculinity. And I think you've kind of gotten a key to it. It's being able to look in the mirror every day and knowing that I'm head of my family, I'm being a good leader, I know how to do things, I'm providing.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think, one of the dangers of the internet is it tends to promote and funnel things that cause fear and outrage. But if you spend the majority of your day working in more rural areas away from the worst of the cities, whether that's driving across the country or just at a job site, you find that 95% of America is still quite good.
Yeah.
There's great people around, and not everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And, as Jordan Peterson likes to talk about with cleaning up your room, the power to take hold of your life and to live your best life is available to you. It's here right now. You don't have to wait for the political stars to align to permit you to have the freedom that you've been promised but deprived of. No, it's here right now.
Yeah. Like the energy that's spent on complaining about feminism or bemoaning the lack of initiation. But a lot of that, I mean, I can see that you're kind of, I don't know if you can self-initiate, but a lot of the skills, I mean, you're doing hard things and proving to yourself that you can do hard things.
Yeah. Initiation and ritual is a very tricky, complex subject. I don't feel qualified enough to talk about that just yet, though I'm working on it. I'm reading a very dense book by Roy Rappaport at the moment about ritual and language. But yeah, it's there's still value in engaging in these debates and going on the offense because it's fun. It can be your reason to get out of bed in the morning. Like, again, to borrow a Hitchensism, he was what's famously said, I spend most of my time in a very bad mood. I hope it shows. I get out of bed, check the newspaper. Do they still say all the news that's fit to print? Yes, they do. Do they not know the difference between a tautology and, oh, never mind, does the Wall Street Journal still have their horoscope? Yes, they do. And it's a reason to go out and fight. And I remember going through Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. I got about 2/3 of the way through it, and it was the closest I think I've ever come to actual depression. I could not finish that book. And the way I muscled my way out of that was I challenged a good pagan friend of mine, because I was a practicing Christian at the time, to a debate, and just spent the week preparing, ready for the fight on that. And it's a great way to motivate yourself. And I know a lot of guys talk about, imagining, a hunt or a fight as they go and hit the gym. And it's a great feeling. So it's not like don't ever participate in the debate on feminism or anything like that. But
sure, yeah. That being in a bad mood, that being disgusted, that being depressed is what makes me sit forever in meditation and ask the question, what is the meaning of life? What are we doing here? And what is initiation? What was it? What was it meant to be? That's the basis of, things I'm working on. But you get into that thing of arguing with what is, and you become stagnant and bitter, and you don't go anywhere. So I think striking the balance, wrestling with it, and that's vital. That's life-giving, as opposed to being just bitter about it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that Nietzsche was trying to get at in The Birth of Tragedy. With there's something connected between the embracing of the sadness and the tragedy in a tragedy, and the embracing of life itself. And one of the things that Nietzsche was trying to deal with, or at least articulate how the Greeks dealt with, was the so-called wisdom of Silenus, which is the story of a king who captured a demonic centaur, supposedly very wise, and he questioned Silenus, what is best in life? And Silenus says, "Oh, mortal, here for a day and gone tomorrow. Why do you ask me what you don't want to hear? The best in life is to never have been born. But the second best thing is to die soon."
Oh,
and this was taken as, very profound wisdom in a Bronze Age world full of suffering and blood feuds and stuff. And what Greek tragedy represented to Nietzsche was a repudiation of that wisdom, that no, in fact, life is worth living in the face of all this suffering. And it's what caused Achilles in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is speaking to him in the underworld, to say, "I would rather be alive as a slave to a slave, as a field serf, than king among the dead." That embracing of life has to involve embracing the sad parts about life too, and seeing them as motivation to get out of bed in the morning.
It almost reminds me, and I don't know if you would agree with that verse in the Bible that says that Paul said, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain."
I'm not a huge proponent of Christianity, precisely because it seems to reject this world in favor of preference for the next. It's created an idealistic image of a perfect world, and that perfect becomes the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Complicated subject on language and idealism.
It might be what Christianity has evolved to. Once you get your golden ticket, then hey, just write it out here. You're on your way. I get what you're saying. One thing I wanted to ask you about, were you raised in a traditional family, or?
I wouldn't say so. I was raised in a pretty, I would say, white-collar, default liberal. We went to church most Sundays, and that was more or less the extent of our religiosity. I got much more serious about my Christianity in high school at a personal level, but that was me more than my family.
So your journey kind of started with getting more serious about Christianity, and then sort of evolved. Yeah,
it was sort of a ping pong. I became very Christian, and then discovered the new atheist movement, and then jumped in that direction. And then after finding Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and later on Jordan Peterson, was like, maybe I misunderstood a few things. So diving back into the Bible and saying, nope, it had bad things going on from the beginning. And then that evolved into my book about Christianity, which I don't know if I want to push on any Christian readers here.
Yeah.
But there are some strong and beautiful arguments for Christianity. They weren't compelling to me, though.
And I mean, I think that brings us right back to where we were at the start. We can get along. People can get along.
Right.
And just your consideration of, hey, that book might not be for you. It was for me, and it might be for some people.
Yeah.
But
well, and I get a tremendous sense of gratification when a Christian will read my book and they won't find my disontological argument against God compelling, but they find everything else helps them be a stronger Christian because they're like, oh, you really got this part right. And I'm like, excellent. That's a point to, Seraphim Rose or Robert Barron or C.S. Lewis is always a good, everyone, regardless of their religion, should read C.S. Lewis, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And I thought it was funny. I looked up that book on Amazon just in preparation for this, and there was one-star review, and just the way she worded it, I can tell you exactly who that person is, why they were so offended, just kind of to be expected. It's like, I can't open my mind to even consider anything else.
If my books have a primarily 5 stars and 1 stars, I'm reminded of the Bill Burr pretty good spread. There's the shotgun. I'll take that. It's the 3 stars that really cut to the heart of an author on Amazon.
Yeah.
Oh, especially if they're verified purchase. Some people aren't ready for that. And I mean, I'm not trying to deconvert people either. I don't know how far we want to go down the Christian rabbit hole, but there is a way to be an authentic Christian that is genuinely admirable, in my opinion. But a lot of men seem to be drawn to Christianity because they think if we return to tradition, we can save the West. We can save our countries and so forth. And when you look at Christian theology, that mission is incompatible with authentic spirituality. You have to die to this world and die to your attachments to the world and to even hate the world, which hates Jesus, in order to truly adopt an authentic Christian spirit. Yeah. It's kind of a binary all or nothing thing. And so, there is a way to be authentic in that spirit. But in my research on Christianity, I came across a sociological term, moral therapeutic deists, which are apparently the group that are most predominant in the United States. They believe that God is this person in the sky who mostly doesn't interfere with things except when you have things that you want, and good people go to heaven. And the purpose in life is to be nice and feel good. And people interpret this as Christianity, which it's not. And it's a very naive, feel good, seemingly harmless, but I think in reality actually quite harmful worldview. And that's the sort of thing that annoys me much more than real Christianity. And I hope it annoys real Christians too, because they're trying to give your religion a bad name, essentially.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that if you look at what Christ was actually after, or what he was teaching, and the fruit of the Spirit, you'll know them by their fruit. And this is the fruit. I look at somebody like you, and you're living a life of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness and goodness and self-control. If Christ was wandering around a neighborhood, and you said one of these people is a Christ follower, I don't think it's always going to be the person who considers himself to be a true Christian, because there are a lot of people who've taught me a lot about what I believe Christ was really trying to teach that weren't identifying as Christians.
Yeah, there is a very interesting discussion to be had. I wrote a fair bit about the fruits of the Spirit and their relationship with the purpose of Christianity in the book, which I do feel obliged to share at this point. It's called Holy Nihilism. It's not advocating nihilism, which some people took it to be. The basic idea is that as far as the fruits of the Spirit are concerned, there is a pagan book in the Bible, Ecclesiastes. And it begins with this wise king doing essentially a thought experiment, where he's imagining what life would be like without God. And so this is euphemistically expressed as life under the sun. And so when he says, "And I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor wealth to the man of knowledge and understanding, but chance and circumstance happeneth to them all. He's essentially saying there is no justice in a world without God. Mm-hmm. And so the best you can do is enjoy the good in your work and enjoy the good things in life and take that as your lot. And there's this quite beautiful passage of poetry in Ecclesiastes where he says, there's a time and a purpose for everything under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to kill, a time to, heal, a time to be joyful, a time to mourn, and so forth. And that expresses a kind of balanced view that maps onto other seasonal pagan traditions where there's a time and there's a season for everything. There's a time to put up Christmas lights and a time to take them down. There's a time to put out jack-o'-lanterns and to maybe make some pumpkin pie. What Paul is talking about with the fruits of the Spirit is he's expressing a certain list of positive attributes and saying, against these things there is no law. There is no time in which these things are not appropriate. It is not inappropriate to be joyful, even at a funeral. It's not inappropriate to love even your enemies, which is sort of an inversion. But it follows if you disconnect from the world. It follows if your treasures truly are in heaven.
Yeah.
And because there's no reason to hate. There's no reason to be sad. There's no reason to rend. There's no reason to feel any emotions that would be attached to the things of this world at all. And so Ecclesiastes 3 and the fruits of the Spirit, there is some crossover, but it's only sort of a partial Venn diagram crossover, not a full one-to-one. At least that's been my reading of the text. It's a very complex subject that ties back to, well, what is the best key to interpret the Bible through? What's the correct filter to understand it? Because people can find verses to support any position they want.
Yeah, I love your explanation of against such there is no law, because that has caused a little bit of confusion for me. Like, what does that mean? But it makes sense.
Yeah, I actually got corrected amusingly when I wrote my first book. I was doing what everybody does. I have my position, so I'm cruising through the Bible to find justification for my own position, which is that hatred is a Christian value and can be unjustified. And I found Psalm 139. Where David says, "Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies." And I'm like, cha-ching, perfect. Got my rubber stamp, going about my work. Yeah. And then I was transcribing videos for Rev, just for a little extra side income. And I came across a theologian teaching some seminary class about Psalm 139.
Wow.
And he said, now let's look at this passage. This psalm is divided into essentially 3 parts. And the first part is David saying, Lord, you know everything about me. You knew me before I was stitched together in my mother's womb. There's no point in me sharing anything with you because you already know it all. But I'm going to share it anyways. I'm going to bring my heart to you.
Yeah.
That's the first part and the longest part. And the second part is just him venting. He's saying, these freaking people, God, basically. Oh. And what I had quoted out of context was him sharing his feelings with God. It wasn't expressing some God-like sentiment. It was him sharing his feelings with God. And then the final section of the psalm, which was only 2 lines, was him essentially saying, I don't know if this is the right way to feel or not. Guide me on the path of righteousness. Completely changes the entire
it certainly does.
sentiment. And the feel of the verse and the purpose of the psalm, and puts it, in my opinion, more in a Christian line, what you might see with Paul or with Jesus himself, and less in line with what we see in something like Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, I love that. Wow, what a serendipitous moment, for you to have that assignment.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
It was a very funny moment, and it's kind of once you get to a certain point, it's kind of fun to be corrected like that, because it creates these stories, but you find yourself in gradually stronger and stronger positions with time as you adopt the corrections rather than just rejecting them out of hand.
Yeah, to me, I feel like that perspective is so valuable. I feel the same way. Bring it. I'm willing to wrestle with anybody. I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. And if you can get off the mat and realize that, wow, I I'm right about this. It really means something to you. But then the times when you realize there's nuance there that I wasn't even considering, that's also thrilling.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on and to talk to you for just a minute is because you are a great example of balance, and, you're considering things like family with your strength and intellectual integrity and honesty, along with that pursuit of being right and correct, and learning practical skills along with being correct about things. I think that so much of what we're enduring right now is an intellectual war or an exercise. And for the people that are only conditioning their bodies or cleaning their guns, I believe as men, you have to understand what you're fighting against. And if you don't, you can't really be effective. If your highest good is just to be right and have your gun, you're going to get mowed under.
Right. There's a legendary story about Shaolin monk training where they would, the final test, they have to pick a weapon off the wall to face some unknown monster in the next room. And there's like a spear, there's a sword, there's tri-staff or whatever. And also on the wall is a broom. And they pick whatever weapon they end up with, and they open the door, and the floor is covered in scorpions. And it's like, if you picked the sword, that's not probably the right tool for this. And, and so many American men are like, we're going to use our guns to defend our liberty. And it's like, yeah, you can try that. That usually doesn't work in history. The American Revolution was so successful, arguably, because there was a whole generation of guys who leveraged what Sun Tzu called the moral law, which is the law that causes men to take up arms and fight in the first place. They were pamphleteering. They were writing. They were borrowing from John Locke and a certain Scottish philosopher whose name I forget on the concept of when the theory of legitimate government would permit and justify a revolution. And they were spending all of this time using words and ideas as weapons, without which the guns probably would not have done very much. For most people, in most of their life, the broom is going to be the much more valuable weapon than the sword. Not to say you shouldn't know how to use the sword. Exactly. Not least because it's fun. It feels good, does good things for your body, hormone wise and physically. But at the end of the day, taking charge of your life is a lot of really mundane stuff, a lot of intellectual stuff. My big fight over the last week has been with a Jeep that hasn't been cooperating and tracing down an electrical problem in the starting motor. Is, tyranny a big problem? In theory, yes, but little mechanical issues like that can be as big of a problem too. And I guess the name I would put on what I've been pursuing this whole time now, which I didn't have the name for when I was 17, was virtue. There are different names for different ethical theories. There's deontology, there's divine command, there's utilitarianism. But virtue at the root is really just excellence, or excellences in the plural. And they work with each other in a symbiotic way once you acquire them. But it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes patience, and it takes pushing aside the romanticism that draws a lot of young men into more idealistic and absolute worldviews that can lead them more down a tragic and naive heroic path. That's not how it is often portrayed, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I feel the same tension when I come across someone like that. I want to tell them, when you romanticize that worldview, you're not telling yourself the whole story about what historically happened and to what we've been talking about the whole time. You have to let all the facts come in. You have to try to see it all, and then you can make a better decision.
Yeah, and to not be disillusioned when the facts don't quite map onto your idealistic depiction in your mind of how things are. I was extremely disheartened when I learned that, for example, the freedom of speech originally didn't mean this more absolute version I'd intended it to mean. Mm-hmm. There was a few months where I was feeling a little down about that. People, I think, get that sensation about America, about their families, about themselves even, and about other idealistic goals or worldviews that they have. To learn to not reject something just because you misunderstood it, I think is a key in the progression from adolescence into becoming a more mature man.
Yes, definitely. And you see that across the board. Like when you first get married, your ideological viewpoint of marriage, and you realize that everybody that has a happily ever after has really worked for it. There's no
Oh yeah.
easy way to get there. And you don't
Oh, yeah.
know that when you first say I do and the hormones are surging.
Oh
So,
yeah, no, marriage is an excellent example of that. Maybe the perfect and most universal example of, if you maintain that idealistic romantic view, you're going to be very unhappy.
yeah, you are.
But if you allow yourself to step back and learn what this is about from the ground up again, and to build something, it's like, okay, we want different things here. How can we negotiate this going forward? Then you can build something that's truly admirable. And one day you find, I'm not saying I'm necessarily here yet, but one day you sort of find yourself very nearly approximating that original idealistic vision you had in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to tell you how much of a treat this has been to me, just to have a great conversation with someone. It really means a lot. And
Thank you so much. The feeling's mutual.
I don't want to get away though without, I want you to tell people about the new book that you just wrote that came out late last year, and maybe a little bit about the podcast you just started.
Sure. My most recent book is called The Hero and the Man. It's about my favorite author of all time, which is Homer, and about how the Iliad and the Odyssey relate to each other. In the academic world, people really grapple with the Iliad and sort of view the Odyssey as this kind of inferior, separate work. And I try to bring them together in a way and explain how deeply Homer has affected our broader culture, and how maybe understanding Homer can be a guide to understanding ourselves and where we are in that world. It was probably my most fun work, though it leaned very heavily on Dr. Greg Naj, who's become one of my favorite academics, just a phenomenal workhorse of a philologist and classicist.
A lot of people that tune into Mission Manhood or that I interact with are kind of younger guys that are just starting to try to figure out which way to go. It sounds like that might be a great introduction book.
Oh, sure. And Homer is such a great example of exactly this, too, because the Iliad is such a young man's book. It's about men fighting other men in a world of men, of young men specifically. There are a few old men who try to give advice and they're ignored and brushed aside.
That sounds like pretty much like what we're going through here.
Exactly. And it's a great story of anger and injustice and where that takes people. The Odyssey is a little different because it's the story of what happens after that. And we get a glimpse into men trying to return back home and putting aside the idealistic, heroic impulses of youth for a life that is alive in the present world, and to reconnect with not just your family, but with your father and your son and your home and your kingdom. And it's a fascinating story that tracks both, I think, the natural cycle of a man going from adolescence into more mature adulthood, but also that man's understanding of language, which informs him. You know, you have this very idealistic view of what language is and of the possibility of immortality through song that we see people pursuing. Oh, people will sing songs about me. And a more mature understanding of language, which perhaps ties into the ritual subject we were alluding to earlier, changes that view a little bit. But it's not the sort of thing that you can actually convey directly to a younger man. How could you tell a young man what it means to be a father? There's no way to convey that. They just have to experience. All you can do is sort of prime them to understand what they're seeing when they do eventually see it. But you can't bring it about before its time has come.
Right. Wow, that sounds amazing. And can you remind me of what the name of your podcast is?
Sure. It's the Caffeine Stream, and I know it's on Spotify. I'm trying to keep them up on YouTube as well.
Okay.
It just came out a couple weeks ago. We have
Yeah.
one on the religious dimension of school shootings, which is sort of a dark subject. And our second one was on wholesome paganism, which has my wife in as well. So that was kind of fun.
Well, I think I told you I saw one of your videos. You were sitting and there was a train in the background and you were talking about the differences between modernism, postmodernism. And I thought, wow, this guy is really gifted in taking these, complex subjects and putting them in a way that people who haven't really been exposed to it can understand. So I was super excited to hear that you're starting a podcast, and I hope that you'll continue to do that.
Well, thank you. I've got a third one lined up for next Sunday evening, and I'll try to keep going from there.
Yeah. Well, where can people find you if they want to connect?
Instagram's probably the easiest one.
Okay.
CB Robertson or Caffeine and Philosophy. I also have a blog. I haven't been as active there as I used to be because I write on Instagram more. It's good for my writing. It makes me condense things down a little bit more. I occasionally try to write in a few other places. I write for Jack Donovan's website on occasion. I have one more I need to do there. And I wrote a piece for Chest magazine on science a few months back that got some positive comments from people about science.
Well, I, again, appreciate you joining us today, and I look forward to seeing what you'll do next.
Thanks so much. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.